Good afternoon. Welcome to the College of Continuing Professional Studies webinar, The Power of Business Storytelling. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Guest, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs that we offer, please contact the Information Center. Contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. Stories can bring meaning to an organization's brand. Stories can illustrate an organization's core values in action. Stories can emphasize the need to change. Stories can reflect on an organization's mission, purpose, and strategy. Karen Dietz of the National Storytelling Network defines the story as an act of communication that provides people with packets of sensory material that allow the listener to quickly and easily internalize the material, understand it, and create meaning from it. Storytelling can help you create impact inside your organization, whether you need someone to back your organization, invest in your idea, or get excited about following your lead. Storytelling can position you to succeed. David Hirschey provides leadership and support for organizational development, reward and recognition, and employee relation activities for emerging growth and middle market organizations in both the public and private sectors. David's previous industrial experience includes managerial and executive positions at Xerox Corporation, Frito-Lay, and General Mills. David has authored articles on negotiation, leadership, and motivation and consulting. David has received a BA in Business and Economics and an MA in Industrial Relations from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming David Hirschey.
Storytelling is a way to organize information, convey certain emotions, memorialize occasions, as well as building relationships within a community. Increasingly, in businesses, storytelling has taken on popularity. Paul Smith, in a text on Lead with the Story, notes that certain organizations, such as Nike, requires all executives to be designated as corporate storytellers. Locally, 3M has banned the use of PowerPoints and specifically bullets to articulate points of view and replace them with a process of strategic narratives. Procter & Gamble, in fact, has gone so far as to hire Hollywood directors to teach executives the storytelling techniques. Several schools, business schools specifically, have added storytelling to their management curriculums, or at a minimum as an elective in their communication components. Would like you to think through the options within an organization or within your family as to why storytelling would work and storytelling with intention. You have on the slides a half a dozen blanks. I would like you to think about throughout the course of this webinar, as well as some personal questions of when storytelling would work or when it wouldn't work. As the day progresses in the day-long program, we practice with different types of stories and different types of scenarios to make storytelling more effective. I've had the privilege several years ago to teach an executive communication course down in Rochester, Minnesota. I had 12 executives, and we were talking about the structure of formal communication and who does the individual that's being the communicator or the presenter focus on. And the discussion at that point in time was, does the focus look at the presenter, or in our case, the storyteller? Do you focus on the audience, or do you focus on the story? And it was interesting, with that group of executives, 11 indicated the most important individual in the structure of presenting was the presenter. Unfortunately, not disappointingly, they think that they're the main show. And one individual indicated that they focused on the story. Personally, I think of Colin Powell as having wonderful style, content, context. I have paid to hear Colin Powell. When I think of the audience, it depends on the size and the background and the intent, the story, the content, the topic. After the course, it was a 12-week course, it was interesting to take a poll of the executives again. And to the person, it was 12 and 0. Rather than going with 11 on focusing on the presenter and 1 on the story, all 12 indicated the most important component is the audience. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the audience from a storyteller's perspective. How do you address the audience? One of the things that I've learned is that in order to be an effective storyteller and a storyteller with intention in business and elsewhere, is you have to connect with the individual's head, you have to connect with the individual's hands, and you have to connect with their heart. Those 3 focus areas are what, in fact, is going to have the audience committed and heard whatever you're sharing with them. Would like you to think about how you connect with the head, how you connect with the hands, and how you connect with the heart. An effective communicator, leader, or educator needs to have what we'll call emotional intelligence to ensure that the audience, the heart, is engaged. I personally have had presentations, courses, dialogues that I've looked at the audience or the person and understood that they weren't engaged. I then stop, look, and listen and try to figure out what's going on for both them and myself. Briefly, in order to engage the audience, the 3 parts, the head, the hands, and the heart, I would like you to think about, with the head, we have to have an intellectual buy-in. The individual has to have an understanding of the presenter's basic information, the illustration, the experience, and the extent, structured in such a way that it can be remembered and provides order and meaning. The head is an extremely important compartment to connect with the audience. Also, the individual's hands. We would like the story to have a behavioral effect, specifically a change in certain types of behavior. At its base, a story has to have an issue at stake that's of consequence to the story's audience, something that the members of the audience would desire to experience in a state of resolution or fulfillment, an issue that revolves around an arching need, a human issue that matters to them, a place, or an impact. One of the things that most storytellers lose contact and context with is the heart. They focus more on the head, or they focus most on the structure. Finally, the heart, the emotional buy-in, and understanding that stories need to fulfill a human emotion, the content of the story. And I agree with Bill Johnson, who identifies 3 different areas. People have a need for something that assigns a desirable, discernible meaning or purpose to certain events in their life. A story, and a well-told story, promises the audience a dramatic journey that offers a resolution and a fulfillment to some lifelike issue, events, or needs. And we look for ones and ways to organize the chaos that's associated with our activities and issues. A good storyteller can provide these issues. I indicated the model that I'm going to introduce today is what I call the plot method. And simply, the plot is an acronym that can keep something in mind, and 4 components: plain. Keep any story simple, colorful, personal if possible, and clear. Light. You don't need to confuse people. If people don't understand where you're going to go or why they're going to go there with you, you don't need to shock them to get their attention, but it needs to be light. Obvious, if in fact you're speaking to a group of scientists, or if you're speaking to the people assembled for the Thanksgiving dinner, it has to be obvious what the story and the theme will be remembered. And I would say of the 4 components in the structure of a good business story or an effective business story, it needs to be tight. It has to be short and to the point. You need to get rid of what I'll call unnecessary parts and remove things that aren't of importance. When we're talking about a story, there's a lot of components to a story. Most important probably is the theme or the plot, the sequence or series of events and actions of the story, the novel, the play. And as a plot continues, it builds around generally a conflict or the resolution of a conflict. It rises through various stages, the exposition, the rising action, climax, falling action, and finally the resolution. I'm going to depart from one of the things that I opened with, that you want to make it short and tight. when you're looking at a story, there's actually a variety of parts of a story. I've listed as many as 19 here. I'm going to give an ever so brief overview of these 19. This is really a check mark or an opportunity for an individual to say why a story worked or why a story didn't work. I would not sit down and try to ensure that you hit all 19 points in a short, plot, tight story. Perhaps the illustrations will stand out of why a story worked or didn't work. But again, briefly, I'm going to run through the literally next 19 slides to discuss the parts of a story, and would like you to think about the parts that have worked for your stories or the parts that don't work for other stories. So button your seatbelts. We're going to go fairly quickly on the components that would make up a good story. First is what I'll call the exposition. The setting. What is the time? What is the place? Who are the characters? And again, it needs to be understandable by the audience. What is the mood? What is the cultural, historical perspective? What is the backdrop of the story? We go from the exposition to the rising action, the part of the stories where we have a series of complications and conflict. And what we want to do is establish why the story is important to the audience. If you're going to introduce the rising action, you need to also be aware of the turning points within the story. The story cannot continue to build and build and build. There needs to be a peak within the action, but as illustrated on an earlier slide, where's the conflict going and where's it going to be resolved? This is what we would call the falling action within the story. A lot of individuals that try to tell jokes or humor have a problem that they don't quite understand the resolution. They sometimes will tell the joke in the reverse order, or they'll give away the plot. When we have a resolution within a story, the part of the story's plot, the problem of the story is resolved or worked out. And we want the individuals that are hearing the story to be able to place themselves in that position, that they can go, yeah, I can do that. Or, gee, I'm glad that I don't have to do that. Theme is a part of the story or the central message within the story that connects to the literary or the spoken word. Again, we don't want to have this a historical context, but to make sure that it brings about one or two changes within the individual, their experience, or about their life. It may be directly or indirectly applied. Interpretation uncovers the theme that we have within the organization and within the story itself. All stories are going to have both a conflict that is a struggle between opposing forces. A plot has to contain some type of conflict, be it your aunt or uncle at the Thanksgiving talking about the turkey that fell on the floor that the dog ate part of, and how the hostess overcame that conflict. The conflict can be internal, external, it can be person to person, it can be person to nature, or it can be internal. The conflict is within the individual and themselves. Most conflict that is most appropriate for most stories is probably going to be in the person to self or the internal conflict. That's what most individuals can relate. When you're talking about the external person to society or person to person, most individuals can remove themselves. But when you make it personal and from the person to the self, and the point of view that's offered from which the story is told will directly impact that. Again, most stories come from a first person. Effectively, though, I've heard stories coming from a second or third person, or a sage, an omniscient, all-knowing type of person. You can go on YouTube. I've put together a couple links on the PowerPoints that you can look at. Another effective component in the story is, wait, don't tell me, which is an NPR use. It's a flashback or interrupts the action. It describes a personal event or previous situation that links the context in the context to the story. A lot of individuals are not very good at what we'll call foreshadowing, the use of hints or clues in the narrative that are going to, in fact, be connected later on. Currently, there's a popular movie, Midnight on the Orient Express, that you are given clues and hints throughout the movie that will occur later. That would be a good example of foreshadowing in a story. I probably am guilty of using too much irony in stories. Stories says one thing while meaning another, assuming that the audience is keeping up. Again, if the story is not tight, following the plot format, you're going to lose people with irony. Situational irony works particularly well within a business environment, that you have one set of circumstances, one set of economic environments. You would expect a certain outcome, and sometimes we'll call this unexpected consequences or benefits. Again, you can have irony in a variety of ways: verbal irony, a situational irony, or even a dramatic irony, where words and actions of literature or the characters mean one thing for one person and something else for another. Diction, and I want to emphasize, words do count. Words have meanings, and you in fact need to be aware of the average comprehension of a U.S. college graduate understanding of the English language is about the 7th grade level, so that the individual that uses diction or word choices that are inappropriate will mean a lot less in the story. But then using certain words to create a certain effect, for example, the luminous glow versus the bright and beaming light, both retain the light, but one creates a different feeling due to the word choices. Again, the tone. Think about a story that's been told at a wake or a funeral versus a story that's told at a wedding. Think about the story that's told at the commemoration of a successful business endeavor versus one that is, quote, an autopsy of a failed attempt at trying to resolve a business issue. The author's words or choice of words, the detail, the tone, be it formal, informal, intimate, ironic, outrageous, baffling, depressing. The tone is extremely important given the context and where you're at. That tone, in turn, often helps set the mood, the atmosphere, the feeling, the emotion which the writer or speaker creates for the audience. Characterization, you're now saying, how do we do this all in the plot method, all within making it tight? We'll get to that in a moment. But a good storyteller uses 4 basic methods of characterization. The physical description, I was born beside a quiet lake in the Northland of the Chippewa, or characterizations of your own actions. I was one of 12 children, or the opinion of characters. That buffoon offended me, or the direct comments. Have you ever been in a situation? So certain types of characterizations are going to create the characters and those that remain the same throughout the story, or sometimes a dramatic character. And in business, we're talking about somebody that's undergone a change, that they've learned or they haven't learned. One of the problems that you'll have in business is the application of common sense. And when I'm telling a business situation story, I'll ask the audience, do you understand the problem with common sense? In MBA classes, unfortunately, a lot of people will get out their notepads and take copious notes, and I relate that the problem with common sense is not that common. Those that have business experience can nod in agreement that the characterization, some people can change and some people can't. Going back to words have meaning, the figurative language. Figurative language is common in poetry or in prose. In stories, you can use metaphors, simulations, similes, personifications. Be careful. Figurative languages, again, can sometimes lose the audience. Of the 19 items that I'm referencing, in addition to the words and the choice of words, the imagery, what the storyteller shows the audience. Hopefully today I'm creating some pictures for you. Rather than just telling you, I'm trying to describe a background or an audience that's interested in being engaged with their head, their mind, and their heart. Imagery can help represent certain experiences. He fumed, he fell down, the taste was bitter, the flowers waved at him. So utilization of words as well as imagery is extremely important. So again, when we're talking about the story and talking about a business story, the plot method, plain, keeping the story simple, colorful, personal, and clear. Again, for myself, the most compelling component in the plain is personal. Anytime that you can relate or make the story personal to the individual or to the organization, that can be more compelling. Light, I probably have the greatest difficulty personally with light confusing people. Not necessarily shocking them, but trying to connect the dots. That ties into the obvious, remembering the theme. The goal of the story is to drain the swamp, not to talk about the alligators or the problems that people have. And then tight, another problem that many of us storytellers have. Remove the unnecessary parts. You don't need to get into the complete context. People can sometimes connect the dots themselves. So again, when we're talking about storytelling and storytelling with business, want you to think about the audience, want you to think specifically intellectually how you're getting the audience's buy-in with their head, the intellectual buy-in, the behavioral, what they can do as a behavioral effort with their hands, and extremely importantly, the emotional. In storytelling, if you aren't connecting with the audience, if you don't have their head, hands, and heart, and specifically that emotional buy-in, you're not a good storyteller. Another way to look at storytelling with intention is about reaching and learning. That sweet spot that if you in fact have connected with an individual's head, with an individual's heart, and with an individual's hands, you have then where we're trying to go to with storytelling. And the storytelling is with business, but also with families, is that learning. We want to reach individuals and we want them to learn. Another perspective beyond the parts that I've just articulated or beyond the plot is a perspective on the art of storytelling from Francis Assisi. He who works with his hands is a laborer. He who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. He who works with his hands, head, and heart is a storyteller. Is an artist. I want you to think through, unless you can connect the hands, head, and heart, you're not going to be a good storyteller. So some closing thoughts that I would like before we go to the questions. The concluding elements of a story depend on the audience, and you need to learn what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Remember, if you don't grab the audience's attention, generally within the first 30 seconds, they're going to tune out. They won't care about the speaker. They won't really care about the topic. If you don't connect with the audience, you're not going to have a good story. So always begin with not a good, but a great story. Again, I want to emphasize that storytelling is an art and takes skills, and you can practice it. I want you to think about the skills that you can improve. I would like you to develop an action plan, toolkit, or guides for the next weeks and months that you, in fact, can get better at storytelling. As I mentioned, the University of Minnesota in February will be having a day-long seminar on the business storytelling with intention. Either at that resource or other resources, I've provided a couple. A lot of people would be surprised to know that we are in our 46th edition of the National Storytelling Foundation Festival. So if you have some time and available and want to go to Jonesboro, Tennessee, next October 5th to the 7th, you will hear some world-class storytellers. You can also go on the internet and link to 10 festivals all around the country that you should or could attend on storytelling. You can look at YouTube, and there's a YouTube link for storytelling. You can go to Amazon or your favorite bookstore and pick up readings on storytelling, from TED Talks to a variety of different paperbacks and storytelling for dummies. Again, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to have introduced the concept of storytelling, talking a little bit about the plot method, and specifically, to be an effective storytelling, you need to connect with an individual's head, with their hands, and most importantly, with their hearts. I wish you continued success with your storytelling, and would like to entertain any questions that Michael and or the group has developed. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We really appreciate your insights. We've had a few questions from our audience. The first one is, when is storytelling not effective?
Thank you. Looking at storytelling, you have to look at the audience. If the audience is not prepared for learning, for changing, or for growing, which is generally the need for storytelling in a business, changing, learning, or growing. When you have a problem, generally you can use a story to give examples of previous situations when people have had that type of a problem or another problem, and they were successful. Storytelling is not to be used necessarily in performance management unless you're trying to correct some behavior that you think the individual with previous successes can replicate. I've found storytelling can work in at least 90% of business situations if the audience is engaged and the speaker understands the topic and the audience. It's not effective 100% of the time, but in the vast majority of times, storytelling can be effective.
Great. Can you give us an example of someone who is a good storyteller?
I want you to think in your own experiences. It could be a grandparent, it could be an aunt or an uncle, it could be a business associate. When you hear a story and you remember it, that's a good storyteller. So that, yes, I can identify political leaders, speechwriters, educators, but the good storyteller is the one that you remember, why they resonated with you. So again, I'm going to use Colin Powell because he, in fact, is able to connect with me, with his leadership, with his courage, with his forthrighteousness, with his humor. Humor is important to me, so stories that I remember generally have a component of humor.
Great. And when using a storytelling technique, how can you avoid getting too technical and losing a naturalness in the story?
Again, a wonderful question. Thank you. Keep the plot in mind, and it has to be tight. We tend to want to elaborate or expand too much. So go back to the example of the executive that you've heard that tells the same story over and over and over, and that you can, in fact, repeat some of the ending of the story. That is not a good storyteller, and that's not a good story. It may have been effective for a new employee, for an existing employee, or for a senior employee, but not at that point in time. But then in the same sense, at Thanksgiving, you hear the same story from that aunt or uncle, and it's not offensive. So again, you have to remember, keep it tight, keep the plot, thought in mind, and connect with the heart.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, I'm a public sector employee. What does government need to do to engage with the public through storytelling?
Excellent question. A third of my consulting business is with government and nonprofits. And government employees generally have taxpayers that they're working for. Nonprofits have volunteers, donors, or markets that they're trying to serve. You need to have the story of why whatever activity or action that you're having is serving the taxpayer, or why what your volunteer activities are doing to serve an underrepresented community. So storytelling works extremely well when you're trying to communicate your mission, vision, or values. So as a public service employee, what you're trying to do is resonate that the taxpayer or the constituent understands that you get that you're not there for any other reason than to fulfill the mission, vision, and values of the organization or the department. Public service employees, government representatives, nonprofit, all have wonderful stories, and they can connect with their constituents or with their audience probably better than a lot of different situations.
David, could you elaborate how storytelling can aid in change management and initiatives?
Very good question again. Storytelling takes place throughout an organization. And one of the things those that are lower in the hierarchy can communicate that we don't need to hear that story again, or that story didn't resonate. And those at the top go and talk to the individuals at the various levels and find out what's working and what stories resonate. So again, what you need to do is connect with the head, hands, and heart. And in an organization, there are certain stories that work at a C-suite or an executive level. There are certain stories that may work at mid-level or in a plant environment. The same story does not work across all genres. And what you need to do as the storyteller, understand the audience and the environment that you're in, and understand that the same story doesn't work the same time for the same people. That you need to vary the story or the perspective depending on the audience.
And our next question comes in and they ask, I write a profile of important faculty for a blog post. I have to introduce them in the blog, but that's not very engaging. Where would you introduce them in this brief format?
Again, keeping it short and sweet. The reason that you've drawn the people to the blog is they have an interest in the topic. So what you need to do then is make them aware that there's a reason that you have something compelling in this blog. They're already tuned in or looking at, or they've done a search on keywords for something that they're interested in. So you also initially have perhaps the emotional buy-in of the head, possibly of the hands, focusing more on the emotional buy-in and understanding the need of why that blog or why that post, certain events resonate with the individual.
Okay, great. And the last question, I work in business. I'm curious to get more examples of business leaders that use storytelling to promote and advance their business goals.
Depending on your adaptability and comfort, there are storytelling groups within the Minneapolis market here. You can have the Dale Carnegie groups that will have storytelling. You can, in fact, look at entrepreneurial groups. You can look at universities and educators. You can look at business networks. You can look at professional associations. So depending on your genre, depending on the business market that you serve, you can find either good storytellers or individuals that have stories, successes, or failures. Unfortunately, a lot of the way individuals sometimes are wired, we learn more from failures. I have 4 children. My youngest daughter was 14 at the time, and as a doting parent, I indicated that I would like you to learn from your mistakes, and I indicated that a wiser person learns from other people's mistakes, and the wisest person learns from other people's successes. My daughter then replied, Dad, I want to learn and make my own mistakes. So that story didn't resonate at that point in time. What you can do is look at other people's successes or mistakes and pattern your stories depending on the situation and the audience.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the useful information that you provided for us today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, the University of Minnesota College of Continuing Professional Studies.
As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending a link to the webinar recording in a couple of days. There are a few more relevant courses listed on the slide. If you would like to learn more, you can visit us on our website at ccaps.umn.edu for a full list of classes and education programs. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.